I'm Carmen Alana Tibbets, and joining me in the studio is this Gila woodpecker here. And today we're going to be talking about beetles, specifically the kind of beetles that I use as an embellishment on all of my figures, like the blue one that you can see here on the woodpecker's arm. This is a variation of a traditional technique called stump work. And in stump work, after completing the embroidery design, it's cut out and then reapplied as a three-dimensional embellishment onto another piece of embroidery. Instead of doing all of that stitching by hand, I use a sewing machine. So let's get started. Before we start talking about the technique, let's take a look at one of the beetles. So here you can see the top, which is what most people only see on my work. And I have a combination of fabric and leather or suede. And so on my beetles, the elytra or the wing coverings is always fabric. Usually it's a brocade of some sort. And then the pronotum and the head are the leather or the suede, and that's just glued on. And the back, which most people don't see, you can see the legs here, and then here's the leather that's kind of folded over to form the head. And then you see a variety of different beads. You have the beads that make up the legs, which are pieces of wire, and then the beads that are sewn on as the eyes. And depending on how the leather is folded, sometimes you can see the eyes from the front or the top, and other times you can't. But in any case, what I'm going to be showing you mainly is how to create the body of the beetle. Okay, before we start sewing, we want to take a look at some samples of presser feet. And this is important because we're going to be sewing wire onto fabric. And the thing that's important to look at on your feet is the bottom, whether or not they're flat, as is this general purpose foot is here, or whether there's sort of a wide groove or wide space underneath the foot. This is the kind of foot that you want, and it doesn't really matter what foot it is. This is a flat fell foot. You just want to make sure that you have enough room for that wire, because what would happen with a flat foot, even though there's a little bit of a groove here, as you're sewing along, the foot has a tendency to wobble back and forth, and it's difficult to sew straight or control the wire. So you want to make sure that you have a foot where you can see where you're going and that has that space. Now, to get ready to sew, the first thing that you need to do is get your pieces of wire and bend them into shape. So this is about a 4.5 inch piece of wire, which is way too long, but better too long than too short. And a little bit, well, maybe almost halfway down, I put in a 90-degree angle, and then I bend the rest of the wire around a marking pen to give it this gentle curve. And you'll do that to two pieces, and that will give you the two sides of the wing covering in the beetle, and this is going to go onto your fabric sandwich. So I have a sample of fabric here. This is a lightweight brocade, and then the backing fabric. The wire just goes right on top of it, and in this case I've basted with a narrow zigzag because I wanted the wire to be centered along the design on this fabric. Some fabrics that makes a difference, others it doesn't. So what you're going to do is experiment with the settings on your machine to find a zigzag that's going to go comfortably along the wire on either side. You don't have to do a really dense satin stitch. I just think a fine zigzag is fine. So what we're going to do is go around to this point, and then we'll change our stitch settings. And my machine has a needle down position, but I actually don't use it because I find that it makes it a little bit difficult to move the fabric around. So again, you can experiment, play around, and see what works for you. So now we're going to go up this center, and because I have two wires here, I need to change the settings on my machine. So I make the zigzag a little bit wider and a little less dense, because once we get up to the top, I'm just going to turn it around and I'm going to go right back down the other side. Now if you were doing this by hand, you would be using a buttonhole stitch with a thicker thread. And it takes a lot of time, but I do about 100 beetles at once. so I need to do something that's a little bit faster. The rest of the beetle is pretty much handwork, but this sewing machine method really does speed up the process. I won't worry about taking any back stitches or anything like that, because we're actually going to trim this down to size. So then we're done. The wire isn't completely covered, but it's enough. It's not going to show, you're not going to notice it. So the next step, I'm just going to leave that there. I'm not actually going to trim it off. The next step is to cut it out. And what you want to do is get yourself some nice sharp scissors, and here's a beetle that I already have ready to be trimmed. And you're just going to trim close to the zigzag, but not right up against it, because you don't want to trim those stitches and have them come undone. Once you do this, you are going to have some raw edges. I do not use any kind of seam sealant because I don't like the stiffness that it causes. So then just use your fingernail, rough up those edges, and you'll get some stray threads. And as you continue to work with your beetle throughout the rest of the process, you will have other threads come out, and you just trim them off. And we're done with this step. Okay, the next step is stuffing. And what we're going to do is take a tiny amount of fiberfill and we're going to put it into this little opening between the fabric, the fashion fabric, and the black backing. And to do that, I use a pair of hemostats. And you just very carefully open that up and shove it down in there. And what you want to do is get it down towards the bottom. You're not trying to fill the entire thing, you just want to fill this bottom area right here. And once you're done with that, and depending on the fabric, you may need more or less, you're going to see that already this looks a lot more like a real beetle covering because it has a little bit more dimension now. But this is way too big. This is way too long, and if we look at our beetle from the original example, you can see that this that we've been working on here is a lot longer than the finished beetle, and we have this portion that's folded under, but even so this is still too long. And so what I do is I trim this off. You can measure it, and you can experiment, and you can figure out what works for you, but I actually use the wrinkles along the back of my thumb to figure out how long to do it. That's always consistent. And I just trim that off with a pair of bad scissors, not your good fabric scissors. And then if you see a little bit of the fluff poking out, you want to make sure that that goes all the way down in there. You don't want to see it because it's going to be difficult to fold. So then we get our little wire working tools. And because this is wire here, when you fold this under, it will stay folded under. So you have something that's going to look like this. And there's the back, and you have some raw edges, but that's okay. So now we're going to fold this over to the side like that. And then we're going to do the same thing on the other side. And what that does is enclose those raw edges inside. The wire holds everything in place. So now we're much closer to the final size of our beetle. So you can see comparing the little white guy to the little red guy. So now what we need to do is work on the head. We're going to put in the eyes. We'll do a little bit of sewing here, and then we'll install the leg. The last step in finishing the beetles is adding the head and the pronotum and the eyes and the legs, which will be underneath. And I have threaded a needle with some buttonhole thread. You can also use upholstery thread, and this is important because it's a lot thicker and you can pull on it and it won't break. So what I'm going to do is just put the needle up through, bring it out kind of the tip of what is going to become the head. I'm picking up a large seed bead here, and I'm just going back in straight through to the other side right over here. And okay, that's going to be one of the eyes. And pick up another bead And it's going to go through, and this time I'm coming out the bottom. And you can see from underneath there's the little face. And now I'm going to wrap this thread just twice around, and I'm kind of holding it with my fingers on the other side. And I'm just going to take a big stitch here, pull it tight, make a knot, pull it through to the back, and snip it. And that forms most of the head. This is actually all going to be covered, but that puts in the eyes and keeps this folded over portion folded closed permanently. So the next step is to add the pronotum, and I use leather for that. And I have many scraps of very lightweight leather, and this is sort of a glove weight. So if you have old gloves around the house, that's perfect because it's easy to cut, it's very lightweight, and it's very moldable. So what you're going to do, here I have another beetle, is you're going to just cut a little bit to go over the top of the head, glue it down, and then another sort of jelly bean shape, and you're going to glue that down, and that will create the leather covering. And once it's glued down, looks pretty good. So you can see another one here, and you can use different kinds of leather. Suede works. Felt doesn't look so great, but you could try it. You could try another sort of upholstery type fabric. Anything that doesn't fray too much will work fine. So the last step is adding the legs. And for the legs, what I do is I string bugle beads onto a length of good old floral wire, and I've bent over this end, strung on the beads, and then I've added 2 just sort of normal seed beads in the middle, and then some more bugle beads, and then I happen to have seed beads at the end, and then turned under this last end again, so those will be the feet. Now it's important to have the seed beads in the middle. You don't necessarily need them at the end, you can add them if you want, but these in the middle are important because I stitch on the legs, and bugle beads are actually formed to length by cutting. The glass rod is snapped, and so what that means is the edges of these beads are very sharp, so they will have a tendency to cut the thread that is used to sew them onto fabric. So if you have these seed beads here, they're much smoother, and when you attach the legs onto the beetle, and so I am stitching in between those seed beads just with the back stitch, that thread isn't going to be cut. So it's just going to be another length of the upholstery thread, just stitch through those legs, and then they're done. And then all you have to do is just sort of shape them, and because the bugle beads are straight, then you kind of get something that looks pretty leg-like pretty easily. They bend to shape, and you can have a lot of fun with doing different colors. One of the things that is important is to leave some space on the wire for those beads to move freely, because when you make these bends, that takes up some of the space in the wire. You turn it onto the other side, and then you would be manipulating your legs a little bit to get them in the right position. And we're done. That's it. So this guy is ready to attach to something else. And when I do that, I don't glue them on. I actually sew through the padded underside. I just do a couple of loops, and they just attach right onto one of my figures. Not so bad. After watching all of that, you may think, well, those beetles look great, but they're not amazing. I was expecting something a little more. If that's the case, I suggest that you take a look for this book, the Stumpwork, Goldwork, and Surface Embroidery Beetle Collection by Jane Nichols. As you can see, it's very thick, and it is full of everything you would want to know about stumpwork embroidery. The beetles in this book are amazingly beautiful, and I really do suggest that people try stumpwork by hand because the results are stunning. I use this machine technique because I'm making 100 beetles at a time, and I'm doing production work, so it works for me. In any case, it's a lot of fun. I hope you try it. Let me know if you have questions. See you next time.